Welcome to the deep dive, where we really try to unpack source materials and get straight to the core insights.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into some material focused on the Iranian regime's current situation. We're looking specifically at potential negotiations with the U.S. and also this whole complex web of challenges, both internal and external, that the regime seems to be facing.
Right. And the source material we're digging into today is primarily an interview with Hamid Azimi. He's a member of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the NCRI.
Okay.
And in this conversation, he lays out, several potential outcomes, different scenarios for the regime, and what he sees as the implications.
So, our mission really for this deep dive is to understand the key scenarios that this source believes are in play. What are the potential consequences for the regime? And maybe most importantly, what does this perspective identify as the deciding factor here? The really significant thing shaping the regime's future.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So to really set the stage, this source starts with a pretty fundamental point about the regime's nuclear program. The claim, very clearly, is that the program was designed, and still is, with one main goal in mind: getting nuclear weapons.
Not peaceful energy, then.
Peaceful energy purposes, according to this view, well, that's not the real driver. Not at all.
And the material we looked at, it highlights a specific role for opposition groups here, right? It suggests the NCRI and the MEK, the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran, were apparently key in exposing secret nuclear sites over the years.
That's the assertion, yes.
Yeah.
It specifically points to the 2002 exposures of sites like Arak and Natanz, and even, apparently, a more recent uncovering of a site in Semnan province that had supposedly been active for about a decade, completely under wraps. And the argument being made is that the regime's own behavior kind of reinforces this view. The source notes that, according to their account, the regime has actually never declared any of its nuclear sites to the IAEA.
The UN watchdog.
That's exactly, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And on top of that, despite decades working on this program, they haven't actually built a single power reactor. Not one for generating electricity.
Which, yeah, if true, does seem to suggest the goal isn't really peaceful energy.
That's precisely the source's point. It strongly suggests the intent isn't peaceful power generation.
So the core argument here, the takeaway from this material, is that the nuclear program isn't just some technical project off to the side. It's fundamentally tied to the regime's survival and what the source calls the hegemony.
That absolute dominance.
Right, the absolute control of the Velayat Faqih, the supreme leader. It's presented as like a main pillar holding the whole thing up.
Exactly. Just as crucial in this view as its network of proxy groups or its internal security forces used for suppression, a core pillar for survival.
Okay, so that's the context on the nuclear program. Now moving to those external pressures. The source gets into different scenarios for U.S.-Iran negotiations. What's the first one?
The first scenario they discuss is essentially complete surrender by the regime, meaning they completely halt all uranium enrichment, just as the U.S. has demanded.
And the assessment from this source on that, how likely?
The least likely, that's what they say. Almost impossible.
Why so unlikely?
Well, the reasoning given is that the regime sees the cost as just way too high. It's described as being equivalent to suicide for them.
Because the nuclear program is so central.
Because it's so deeply intertwined with the core identity, the survival, the very essence of the Velayat Faqih. Giving it up is seen as, well, a non-starter, just as unthinkable as abandoning their most important proxy forces.
Okay, so complete surrender is off the table, according to this perspective. What about just continuing the current path? Scenario 2, ongoing U.S. maximum pressure, sanctions, maybe the threat of military action?
This one is seen as more likely than the first scenario, definitely. Right. The source suggests that, from the regime's point of view, they're not actually terrified of military strikes just targeting nuclear sites.
Really? Why not?
The argument presented is that those kinds of strikes, while, damaging, they wouldn't fundamentally overthrow the regime itself. Overthrow, the source insists, has to come from within.
Right. So the thinking is they can maybe weather those specific strikes, and meanwhile, they can try to buy time, work around the sanctions.
Exactly. Circumventing those sanctions is absolutely critical for their day-to-day survival, just keeping things running. So they believe they can manage that by time.
But there's a catch in this scenario too, isn't there, according to the source?
Yes. A significant counter-threat here is the potential activation of international mechanisms. Things like the trigger mechanism or snapback sanctions.
Ah, the mechanism from the original JCPOA deal.
Precisely. As parts of previous deals expire, this becomes a real possibility, a way to quickly reimpose those broader UN sanctions that were lifted before. That's a serious threat hanging over them in this scenario.
Okay, which brings us logically to the third scenario mentioned, trying for a new agreement. A JCPOA2, essentially.
This one is also assessed as unlikely by the source.
And the reasoning there.
It comes down to perceived red lines on both sides that just seem incompatible. The U.S. reportedly wants a complete halt to enrichment. The regime says that's impossible, non-negotiable.
So someone would have to blink, cross their own red line.
Exactly. And the source argues that the U.S. is probably unlikely to be the one to do that again, especially, they say, given the history of alleged deception by the regime, which groups like the MEK and NCRI claim they've exposed over the years. Trust is low.
But here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit counterintuitive. The source material says the NCRI's position is that they would actually welcome a JCPOA too if it were to happen.
Yes, that's a fascinating point they make.
Why? Why would they welcome a deal if they're fundamentally opposed to the regime?
Well, the reasoning presented is that they believe a new agreement, paradoxically, would actually end up making the regime's internal problems much worse. The view is that it would somehow lead to a collapse of the Velayat Faqi's hegemony, that central control, and basically open the floodgates for more widespread popular uprisings inside Iran.
So a deal, instead of stabilizing the regime, might actually destabilize it internally.
That's the specific argument from this source, yes. It's quite a strategic viewpoint.
Okay, so looking at all these external factors, the negotiation possibilities, the sanctions, the military threats, it really does sharpen that central question the interview seems to explore, which is ultimately more dangerous for the regime, these external pressures or its own internal crises.
And the source couldn't be clearer on this. The answer given is definitively the internal element. That's seen as the far greater danger.
Why is that distinction so critical in their analysis?
The explanation offered is that the regime from this perspective is far more afraid of internal uprisings, of organized resistance bubbling up from within, than it is of external sanctions or even military strikes.
Because only the internal pressure can actually topple them.
That's the core argument. Only internal factors, this source contends, have the potential to lead to the regime's actual overthrow. External pressure can hurt them, squeeze them, but overthrow comes from inside.
And the material, it provides some pretty stark examples to back this up, doesn't it? To show the regime's alleged ruthlessness internally versus its calculations externally.
It does. It mentions things like mass killings during protests. It cites a figure of, I think, 90,000 arrests during recent uprisings, and specifically notes over 360 MEK members who reportedly went missing after being arrested.
And it brings up the 1988 massacre, too.
Yes, the massacre of some 30,000 political prisoners back in 1988, pointing out that their burial sites are allegedly still kept secret today. These are presented as examples of the extreme lengths the regime will go to crush internal dissent.
Which contrasts sharply with how they might, calculate risks regarding external threats like sanctions or limited strikes.
Exactly. And the source also details these ongoing internal social movements that reflect that pressure cooker environment. Protests by retirees, for example, struggling with pensions, trucker strikes.
Which you mentioned could be very disruptive.
Hugely disruptive, potentially impacting 90% of transportation. The source even draws a historical parallel, maybe highlighting infrastructure's importance by mentioning Reza Shah's railway. Plus, there are ongoing actions reported from nurses, students, workers. A broad base of discontent.
So, within that really critical internal picture, the source zooms in on one specific element as being particularly key. What is that?
That would be the resistance units. Kanunhay Shareshi in Persian. These are units associated specifically with the MEK.
And when did these reportedly become active?
They reportedly started operating officially around 2018 or 96 in the Persian calendar.
And the claim is the regime really fears these units.
Profoundly, according to the source, because despite major efforts, the regime has apparently been unable to stamp them out, to eradicate them completely.
What's their strategy, as described?
Well, it's described as starting small, clandestine groups, maybe just 3 to 10 people initially, but then expanding, growing in numbers, and importantly, deepening their activities.
Moving beyond just symbolic acts.
Right, from things like burning posters of regime figures to more direct actions, like attacking centers associated with suppression, and critically, coordinating these actions across different cities and provinces.
Are there specific examples given?
Yes. The material mentions reports of them simultaneously disrupting state radio and TV broadcasts in multiple provinces. That takes coordination. Also, hacking into the judiciary's computer systems to get and release sensitive information about prisons, prisoners, officials.
And the source makes a point that the regime itself acknowledges these units exist and are active.
Yes, that's presented as a crucial piece of evidence. It quotes the regime's own Tasnim news agency. And Tasnim reportedly described these units as providing a structure for designing and implementing sabotage operations, arson, destruction of public property, and armed actions against official and public centers of the country.
So the regime's own media confirming actions against its own centers.
That's how the source presents it. Tasnim even apparently called them the operational arm of the MEK. The source emphasizes this is the regime's own admission.
The source also mentions this idea of rebellious cities and liberation army units inside Iran.
Yes, Sharhe Shureshi. It's this concept of cities potentially rising up. The source cites a reported example from Shiraz during the 2019 protests, that's 98 in the Persian calendar, where people allegedly controlled parts of the city for about 148 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, apparently requiring the regime to bring in helicopters to regain control. It's presented as an illustration of the potential for organized resistance to take hold, even temporarily.
And it mentions death sentences for some members.
It does. It reports that 9 resistance unit members have been officially sentenced to death by the regime, which again underscores how seriously the regime apparently views this specific internal threat.
So the conclusion this source draws about these units is
That they are not static. They're growing, evolving, and actively preparing for larger actions. And the regime, according to this source, understands this perfectly well and sees them as the primary internal threat, the one that has, in this view, brought the regime close to overthrow in the past.
no, okay, the internal element is clearly framed as decisive here, but the source doesn't totally dismiss the international dimension, right? It talks about the NCRI's activities abroad.
No, it doesn't dismiss it at all. It acknowledges the international arena exists, it has influence, it can't be ignored. The perspective presented is that foreign governments often pursue their own interests, which can lead to policies of appeasement towards the regime.
Policy is not necessarily based on the Iranian people's rights.
Exactly, driven by national interests, economic interests, geopolitical calculations. So the NCRI's strategy abroad is described as trying to build a kind of political umbrella, using international laws, mechanisms, and political systems to counter those governmental appeasement tendencies.
What are some examples of that strategy in action?
Well, the source gives a couple of key examples. One was the long legal battle, apparently 15 years in the U.S. courts, to get the MEK removed from the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations.
Okay.
Another major tactic is working directly with legislative bodies, parliaments, congresses in various countries, rather than just focusing on executive branches or governments.
And it highlights some recent successes on that front, resolutions passed.
Yes, it points specifically to 2 recent resolutions as examples, one passed by the U.S. Congress and another one in the UK Parliament, which reportedly garnered support from a very large number, 560 parliamentarians, across both the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
That's significant cross-party support. What did these resolutions actually say, according to the source?
What's presented as crucial is that they reportedly support the NCRI's 10-point plan for a future Iran. And this is the key part. They explicitly recognize the right of the Iranian people and the resistance units to confront the IRGC.
The Revolutionary Guards.
Yes, the IRGC, a central pillar of the regime's power and suppression apparatus, recognizing the right to resist them.
And the significance of that recognition, how does that function as a political umbrella?
In the source's view, it's hugely significant. It makes it politically more difficult for foreign governments to simply ignore the internal resistance when making deals with Tehran. It forces them to at least acknowledge that their own legislatures have recognized this right to resist. It puts a check on potential appeasement policies.
So it's not asking for permission to resist, but demanding recognition of an existing right.
Precisely. The source emphasizes this point strongly. It's about getting international bodies to recognize a fundamental right that people facing oppression already possess the right to resist, rather than asking for external validation or permission for that resistance.
Okay, so bringing all these threads together, the internal dynamics, the external pressures, the international maneuvering, how does the source characterize this current moment in time for the regime?
It uses some pretty strong language, actually. It quotes Mr. Rajavi, a key figure in the NCRI, as relayed by Azimi in the interview, describing this period as the most critical and dangerous period for the regime, and also as a period of reckoning, particularly for the regime and the IRGC.
A period of reckoning. Why now? What makes this moment so critical, according to them?
It's presented as a convergence of factors. You have the external pressures we discussed, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, regional instability perhaps. You have the regime's own inherent internal fragility, the economic woes, the social discontent. And then, layered on top of all that, what this source sees is the decisive factor, the growing strength and activity of that organized internal resistance, spearheaded by the resistance units. It's the combination that makes it so dangerous for the regime.
And so the source concludes with a kind of call to action. What's the message for supporters outside Iran?
Yes, the concluding message is quite clear. It's a call for supporters abroad to actively support those resistance units inside Iran, and simultaneously to continue working on the international stage to build that political umbrella to push for broader international recognition of the Iranian people's legitimate right to resist the IRGC.
The goal being?
The stated goal is to help accelerate the process, to ensure that the regime's overthrow, which this source sees as inevitable eventually, happens sooner rather than later, driven by the people inside Iran, but supported politically from the outside.
Okay. So stepping back now from this deep dive into the source material, we've heard a perspective that paints the Iranian regime as being under immense pressure from multiple angles.
Definitely. The negotiation scenarios laid out range from, complete surrender seen as highly unlikely to continuing down the current risky path with sanctions and potential threats, or maybe even striking a new nuclear deal.
Which, ironically, this source believes could actually backfire on the regime internally if it ever happened.
Right, potentially fueling its collapse rather than saving it.
But the absolute core tension, the real focal point, according to the source, isn't really about those external deals or pressures. It lies squarely inside Iran.
Yes, in that escalating internal crisis, marked by those widespread social protests and movements we discussed, and critically, by the organized actions of these resistance units, which, as the source stresses, the regime itself seems to acknowledge, are actively operating against its centers of power.
So you have this internal struggle, seen as the decisive element, combined with these international efforts trying to build political support and recognition for the right to resist. And all this source suggests, puts us in a uniquely critical period, a period really defined by the struggle over the regime's future.
A period of reckoning, as they put it, with the internal fight framed as the ultimate deciding factor in how it all plays out.
So a lot to take in there. What really stands out to you from this deep dive as you listen to this perspective, how do you think that interplay, that tension between the intense internal pressures described and those complex external dynamics, how might that actually unfold in the coming months or years? Definitely something to think about.
پایان من شاید زیر گلوله باشد ایام را ولی من هرگز نمی شمارم پایان من شاید مانند یک گل سرخ هاشا که من به پاییز وقتی نمی گذارم گاهی غریب یک رد گاهی تنین رگبار گاهی شکوه صبری در نغمه های سازم تکرار کار من نیست هر روز نوتر از پیش در این مسیر پرکوب نامی حماسه سازم پایان من شاید زیر گلوله باشد ایام را ولی من هرگز نمی شمارم پایان من شاید مانند یک گل سرخ هاشا که من به پاییز وقتی نمی گذارم حضور چادر بی شرم شب را می شناسم میان زمحریره از تب را می شناسم برای مردمان مردن عجب کاریست امروز و من امروز این راه عجب را می شناسم پایان من شاید زیر گلوله باشد ایام رو، ولی من هرگز نمی شمارم. پایان من شاید مانند یک گل سرخ، هاشا که من به پاییز وقتی نمی گذارم. ابلیس ها شکستن تندیس واژه ها را، اما فرشته ما خواهد شد آشکارا. هم نعره ایم و هم باد، هم زخم ایم و هم یاد، تاریخ در کف ماست، صاحب دلان خدا را. پایان من شاید زیر گلوله باشد ایام را، ولی من هرگز نمی شمارم. پایان من شاید مانند یک گل سرخ، هاشا که من به پاییز وقتی نمی گذارم.